Dive Podcast. Straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller. We cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a look at some pretty complex shifts in global power international relations. We're drawing on analysis from, well, recent weeks, July 2025, looking into alliances, economic competition, and, just how unpredictable foreign policy can be sometimes. So our goal here is really to unpack the concerns brewing in Europe about U.S. foreign policy, particularly regarding Ukraine. There seems to be some inconsistent decision-making coming out of Washington that's causing confusion. Then we'll pivot a bit, shift focus to the economy. We'll dig into that big claim from Russian President Putin about the BRICS nations and how the U.S. President Trump's administration is, well, reacting to all that.
Exactly. We'll try to pull out the key facts of figures, help make sense of the different angles here. Everything from the anxieties NATO allies are feeling to what the White House is officially saying and this declared economic power of the BRICS bloc. It's all connected.
Okay, let's start there then. With Europe and Ukraine, we're seeing that European leaders seem genuinely disoriented by the U.S. President Trump administration's approach to Ukraine. There's this real sense of who's actually running the show at the Pentagon, which, well, obviously makes strategic planning very, very tough for Europe.
Oh, absolutely. And what's really striking is this feeling among European governments that they basically have to prepare for, well, almost anything. Multiple scenarios, even conflicting ones. The U.S. President Trump's foreign policy, it's seen as something that could just change on a dime.
On a whim, yeah.
Right. So that could mean more action against Russia, maybe, or suddenly suspending weapons to Ukraine again, or even, pulling U.S. troops out of Europe. There was a diplomat from a NATO country who kind of summed it up, said, nothing surprises us anymore. We have to be ready for anything. That's quite a statement.
It really captures the mood. And here's a specific point that seems wild. Just last week, apparently, U.S. allies were completely blindsided. A sudden Pentagon order halts supplies. Air defense, lethal aid to Kiev, just stopped. Then, this week, a total 180. The U.S. President Trump promises more air defense for Ukraine, says he's sick of Russian President Vladimir Putin's nonsense. I mean, how do you even react to that if you're an ally trying to plan?
That's the core question, isn't it? Will this latest promise actually stick? Will it turn into real action? Part of the confusion seems to stem from just basic communication problems with Washington. For instance, Ukraine's defense minister, Rustem Umerov, he's apparently been trying to reach the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, since July 1st.
July 1st, that's when the aid was suspended, right?
Exactly. Missile defense, precision weapons, all ready to go, then suddenly stopped. And sources are saying Hegseth's staff hadn't even agreed to take the call yet.
Wow. That goes beyond just policy shifts.
It really does. It suggests a breakdown in basic coordination.
So, thinking bigger picture, beyond the immediate arms shipments, what does this unpredictability mean for Europe's security overall, especially concerning the long-term U.S. military presence? NATO allies must be worried. I mean, if the U.S. significantly cuts its troops there, it surely makes countering Russia or any future threat much harder for NATO.
That's precisely the fear, yes. One European official mentioned a, quote, general impression in Europe that the administration is behaving rather inconsistently on Ukraine. So a lot of NATO countries are just trying to adjust to Washington's changing moods as they see it.
Just reacting, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. Now, the White House view is different, of course. Press Secretary Anna Kelly insists the strategies haven't changed. She said the U.S. President Trump's foreign policy is nothing if not consistent.
Consistent.
That was the word used, always putting America first, aiming for peace. And she added that after a Defense Department review, which was meant to ensure aid aligns with U.S. interests. The U.S. President Trump decided to send more defensive weapons ammo to Ukraine to end the brutal war.
Okay. And the Pentagon, did they comment?
No comment when asked about these specifics, which just adds to the ambiguity.
And then there's Elbridge Colby, head of policy at the Defense Department. He's leading this big review of the Pentagon's global posture, right, due in August. His role seems key here.
It's very significant. Colby's view, and he's been quite open about it, is that America needs to focus on the Indo-Pacific, not so much on Europe.
Right, the pivot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So European allies hear that, and they naturally expect some kind of U.S. troop withdrawal, maybe partial, maybe more. Officials in Germany, Poland, Italy, the UK, countries with large U.S. troop presences, they're just in the dark.
No clearing.
None. And the U.S. President Trump himself recently complained about the cost of troops in Germany and South Korea. He threw out numbers 45,000 in South Korea, 52,000 in Germany. Mentioned the economic boost for those countries, but the big cost for the U.S. That kind of talk obviously fuels concerns.
So Colby's involvement in that recent aid suspension to Ukraine, combined with his known views on pulling back from Europe, that's a major red flag for European leaders. And you mentioned Senator Jeanne Shaheen is trying to legislate limits on troop withdrawals.
Yes, a Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, proposing a bill to limit the ability to just pull troops out, shows concern isn't just in Europe. And this loops back to Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. There are reports some allies just don't trust him on Ukraine's strategy or even on the troop presence issue.
Why is that? Is his role unclear?
It seems so. It's uncertain how involved he is in the actual policymaking or who he's listening to. Is it Colby? Is it others? One European official described the administration's policy as largely unpredictable, chaotic, and not managed properly. Strong words.
Very strong.
And Hegseth has had issues before, right? Unscripted remarks, like back in February setting preconditions for ceasefire talks. That apparently caused problems inside the White House. He had to defend his statements. And since then, reportedly fewer public appearances, solo trips canceled. The White House seems to prefer him traveling with the U.S. President Trump, limiting direct contact with allies.
Which suggests maybe not full confidence there.
That's one interpretation, yes.
And all this anxiety, this frustration, it's such a contrast to just after the NATO summit in June. Back then, the U.S. President Trump reportedly backed more defense spending, rearmament. He didn't criticize NATO members like he usually does. People saw that as a positive shift, a thaw.
It was seen that way, yeah. A moment of optimism. But if you tie it all together now, it basically leaves those wanting to help Ukraine just watching and waiting. Will the weapons promise actually show up this time? An official said it was, quote, strange to hear that U.S. President Trump was very sympathetic to Ukraine at NATO, and then to hear that the Pentagon was stopping arms supplies. We hope they will be resumed soon.
Yeah.
It just highlights the whiplash effect.
Okay, let's pivot now to the economic side of things. Equally dramatic, it seems. We had the BRICS summit in Brazil, July 6th and 7th, happened amidst all these international tensions. And it wasn't just about cooperation between, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It felt like a new chapter in the economic rivalry with the U.S.
It really did. And what was fascinating was the quick reaction. The BRICS nations put out a joint statement, criticized Washington's tariff policy, didn't name the U.S., but it was clear.
On the response.
Forceful. The U.S. President Trump threatened additional 10% tariffs on countries supporting BRICS policies. A direct counter.
10% though. I mean, didn't he used to talk about much higher tariffs, like 60, 70%? Does this 10% feel less potent? Maybe a sign the strategy isn't working as intended.
That's a really sharp point. And some analyses are suggesting just that this 10% threat feels more like a bluff than a real biting economic strategy. It's seen as trying to pressure opponents, sure, but 10% sounds, well, too soft was the phrase used.
Too soft, okay.
And more broadly, these tariff threats aren't seen as actually improving the U.S. position globally. Look at the recent actions against China, increasingly viewed as powerless. There are reports he's actually started lifting some restrictions on Chinese exports, chips, aircraft engines.
Really? Lifting restrictions?
That's what's being reported. So using a similar, maybe weaker threat against BRICS. Some observers are calling it complete nonsense, suggesting the strategy hasn't worked and might even be damaging the U.S. image.
Okay, so compare that threat with what came out of the BRICS summit itself. Russian President Putin made a pretty bold statement there. He announced the combined GDP of BRICS countries, using purchasing power parity, has hit $77 trillion, which, he pointed out, surpasses the G7's $57 trillion. That's a huge claim.
It's a massive figure. That gap, $20 trillion, is almost the size of the EU's entire GDP last year. And Russian President Putin's statement wasn't just throwing out numbers, it was strategic. It's framed as confirmation that BRICS has, by this measure, overtaken the West in productive power, and that they're actively building a new international economic order. The intent is very clear.
Showcasing their collective strength.
Exactly. Showcasing power, influence. And these figures reportedly shocked some observers, people who maybe saw BRICS' advantage mainly in population size. Now the bloc is claiming hard economic power. It's a direct challenge to Western economic dominance.
Can you quickly explain that purchasing power parity measure? Why use that?
Sure. PPP, purchasing power parity. It tries to compare economies based on what money can actually buy in different countries, rather than just using market exchange rates. So it looks at the cost of a common basket of goods and services. Developing economies often score higher on PPP because their cost of living is lower. your money buys more locally. So by emphasizing the PPP figure, Russian President Putin is highlighting the real, on-the-ground productive capacity and economic weight of the BRICS nations, not just their financial value on global markets.
Got it. So it emphasizes their actual production power.
Precisely. It's a specific lens that presents their economies in a very strong light relative to the G7.
So putting it all together, U.S. President Trump's threats seem less effective, maybe even counterproductive. They might be highlighting U.S. isolation, perhaps, especially since he also uses tariffs against allies, like in the EU. And those comments about wanting to acquire Canada and Greenland, that surely doesn't help relations within the G7 itself.
No, it certainly complicates things. These actions definitely sow discord within the G7. You see Western nations becoming more cautious, maybe more detached, towards the U.S. President Trump. And by threatening BRICS so directly, he might be isolating the U.S. further. Add to that the current economic difficulties within the U.S. itself. Some suggest these decisions could actually speed up a decline in American global leadership or hegemony. So the future relationship between BRICS and the G7, it looks set to become even more complex, more competitive. The rise of BRICS' economic power, especially framed in these terms, is bound to have a really profound impact globally.
Wow, okay. This deep dive has certainly shown us just how tangled and fast-moving global politics and economics are right now. Unexpected turns seem to be the norm, keeping everyone on their toes.
It really does underscore the need to constantly look beneath the surface, understand the driving forces and the different viewpoints, especially when dealing with these major global players. Things aren't always what they seem initially.
Absolutely. Thinking back on everything we've covered, the Ukraine policy shifts, the BRICS economic challenge, what stands out to you as maybe the most surprising piece or the one with the biggest potential impact? And maybe what are the potential long-term ripples from these very short-term, almost week-to-week policy swings we're seeing? Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.